This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance. God of War, the 2018 sequel for PlayStation 4, has finally received a patch for PlayStation 5, and in common with similar updates for Days Gone and Ghost of Tsushima, it opens the door to a classic title running flat out at 60 frames per second, and in common with those other Sony first-party juggernauts, the impact is indeed transformative. After playing God of War at 60 frames per second, it's really difficult to go back to the original release on legacy PlayStation hardware. We get the complete package of beautiful 4K graphics, super smooth visuals and animation, and significantly reduced input lag. It looks better, it feels better, it plays better, it just is better. So in this video we're going to be talking about the patch, assessing overall performance for the game on PlayStation 5, and we're also going to talk about prior versions of the code. After all, we didn't actually need this patch to run God of War on PlayStation 5 at 60 frames per second. The original Gold Master Code, version 1.0, available on the disc version of the game. This actually gave us the ability to run the game flat out, thanks to the fact that on PlayStation 4 and crucially PS4 Pro, this rendition of God of War ran the game with a fully unlocked frame rate, something that opens the door to some interesting analysis. But to cut a long story short, this new patch, version 1.35, essentially offers the same experience as running the version 1.0 code from disk on PlayStation 5, only this time you don't need the disk. But first of all, before we pore over the numbers, we should take the time to appreciate this game and the upgrade. Now, John handled the coverage for God of War when it launched, and I highly recommend checking out his video linked below for the Linneman deep dive into the scale of the artistic and technical achievement this game delivers. All I'd really want to add to that is that Santa Monica Studio made a number of gambles with this title, with this franchise. Risky stuff, but to my mind it all paid off. First of all, there's the profound shift to a more narrative-driven adventure. The original God of War games are more arcade-like, violence-driven brawlers, technically brilliant, wonderfully playable, and incredible showcases for PlayStation hardware. God of War 2018 slows down the pace, and in its camera shift it literally brings us closer to Kratos, and actually tells a nuanced story of profound loss and, believe it or not, parenthood. Kratos has moved on, the story has moved on, and maybe, just maybe, the audience has moved on too. Point is, the franchise is reinvigorated, but it's not exactly been rebooted. I say that because everything that made God of War so epic in prior installments is still there in God of War 2018. The fantastical environments, the gigantic beasts, the visceral, ultra-violent fighting, and of course, Sony Santa Monica Studios' state-of-the-art rendering. Beautiful lighting, physically based rendering for stunning reproduction of materials, extreme geometric detail, ultra-high resolution textures. This is matched with some stunning detail in the character models, backed up by wonderful motion captured performances, absolutely essential in telling the story and doing so convincingly. But obviously, while the studio has clearly moved on, God of War 2018 is a game that respects its technological legacy in extracting the most from its generation of console hardware. And believe it or not, this is actually responsible for what you might call a negative part of the experience, which is more down to the fault of the hardware design and not the developer. Santa Monica Studio pushed the PS4 and PS4 Pro silicon so hard, power consumption was higher than most other games, More heat was generated, and the resultant fan noise, clearly a problem in terms of a quality of life experience when playing the game. God of War actually became the title we would go to in assessing the thermal performance, power draw and acoustics of PlayStation console hardware. And man, playing this game, it could be loud. So before we talk about performance analysis and other software-based metrics, the big deal I would say for God of War on PlayStation 5 is that not only are you getting a minimum doubling of performance, everything plays out as quietly as any other PlayStation 5 experience. It's a big deal. Now, before we go too deep into God of War's 60 frames per second experience on PlayStation 5, let's go back to the game on PS4 and the Pro. So pre-launch, John did have some input into how the 30 FPS mode presented, and after a patch, this is how it looked. Pretty close to launch code and very similar to the game as it is today on PlayStation 4 and Pro. The PS3 era God of War games ran with an unlocked frame rate, and to begin with, so did God of War 2018, and therefore it becomes a benchmark of sorts. Allow me to explain. As you saw in my recent Skyrim PS5 video, unlocking the frame rate allowed us to compare base PS4 to the Pro, native 1080p versus native 4K in that case, and perhaps not surprisingly, a machine with just over 2 times the compute power could not deliver as high a performance level when processing 4 times the amount of pixels. I also said that Sony first-party studios were much more adept at balancing games between PS4 and Pro. And using that Goldmaster code, you can see exactly what I mean. Native 1080p on the Amateur to the left there, checkerboarded 4K on the right with the Pro. So essentially 2 times the resolution throughput on the enhanced machine there, plus the overhead of the checkerboard resolve, the process of integrating 2 1920 by 2160 images into one coherent whole. You'll note that both versions have tearing at the top of the screen. What's happening here is that if a frame slightly exceeds its render budget and just misses a VSync screen refresh, the new frame is delivered anyway, lowering latency but producing that tear line at the top of the screen. But it is only at the top of the screen and it is mostly unnoticeable. The point though is that the FPS graph lines show pretty much level pegging, Pro on occasion running a touch slower. Looks to me like Santa Monica Studio were initially set to continue their strategy of God of War games running with an unlocked frame rate, but as we move away from cutscene cinematics and into combat, frame rates are mostly in 30 frames per second territory. Running unlocked simply adds extra judder, with no real return for the user in terms of lowered input lag or whatever. However, users of PS5 could tap into the original disc code's unlocked nature using next-gen brute force horsepower to get checkerboard 4K 60 frames per second right from day one of the hardware's launch. Problem being that if you updated to the latest version, you lost that extra performance. But by the time reviewers and users originally got to see the game, it was running patched. PS4 ran at 1080p 30, Pro with 2 options. What you're seeing here is checkerboard 4K 30, but there was also an unlocked 1080p variant we'll address shortly. As you can see here, it's effectively a solid 30 frames per second, but there are some dips beneath, and it actually looks like in these scenarios at least, the base PlayStation 4 is a little more consistent. But the bottom line is that a flatline 30 frames per second delivers a new frame every 2 display refreshes on a 60Hz screen, meaning that all the stutter of an unlocked frame rate is gone. I'm trying to illustrate the difference here with a panning camera shot. First of all, we're looking at the game running unlocked. As you move the camera around with the unpatched, unlocked version, you can see the hitching and stutter, and it's kind of represented there on the frame time graph. Every spike upwards to 16 milliseconds, well, that registers as a micro stutter in the actual presentation, and what you're seeing here persists throughout the entire experience on PS4 and PS4 Pro. I don't think it's ideal, and I think Sony Santa Monica Studio might have agreed with us, because with subsequent patches installed, a 30 FPS cap is in place, meaning a new frame delivered consistently. There's that flat line on the frame time graph now, meaning a smoother experience, albeit one that's actually running at a lower overall frame rate. And now let's repeat the experiment here with PlayStation 5. With the extra horsepower, every new frame is synchronized with every refresh on the display. Double the fluidity, double the visual feedback and consistent to boot. Now before we move on to PS5 stats, there is one more interesting experiment we can look at. Running the disk code on PS4 Pro unlocks the frame rate, and at 4K checkerboard we can reasonably assume the GPU is our limit to performance. Then there's the 1080p performance mode on the patched version, where the Pro halves its internal rendering resolution and removes the 30fps cap, so going into this test I was expecting to see the GPU limit from the unlocked 4K readout and the CPU limit from the 1080p mode. But the actual comparisons here in matched action are intriguing. When you see parallel lines like this, it's kind of like a PC GPU benchmark. The same loads at different resolutions tend to see the same peaks and troughs. So I'd say that in this scenario at least, we're GPU limited on the Pro, even at 1080p. However, later on, there is no relationship between the graph readouts between the two modes. Chances are that here, the 1080p mode on PS4 Pro is indeed experiencing another bottleneck within the system, which may well be CPU or memory bandwidth based in nature. So let's recap. Goldmaster code, unlocked frame rate, mostly in 30fps territory anyway, so no real gain to the end user, hence the update to a capped 30fps for more consistency, and a 1080p performance mode on PS4 Pro. The increase in performance there is profound, so while there is judder, you would have lower input lag. But then there was the unintended consequence. With the back compat power of PS5, version 1.0 powered PlayStation 5 users to 60 frames per second, but only if you had that Gold Master code on the disc. The new 1.35 patch, what it does is actually very simple. All it does really is to remove the 1080p reduction on the performance mode, and to make it the default when the game is launched on PlayStation 5. And well, here is the result. PS4 Pro unlocked versus PS5. A GPU limited scenario on last gen hardware becomes irrelevant when you have well over twice the horsepower thrown at the same rendering problem. The initial intro scene is actually fairly representative of the kind of load seen throughout the game in these scenarios, and the PS5 just powers through. It's silky smooth and flawless. Moving into combat, I've changed the comparison here, so it's PS4 Pro with the 30fps cap versus PlayStation 5, both running on the latest 1.35 patch. The Pro can drop beneath 30 frames per second in effects heavy sequences. Alpha effects and volumetrics are bandwidth heavy and seem to cause the Pro some headaches, but it's no problem at all for the PlayStation 5 to hit and sustain 60 frames per second. And I'm going to use the word flawless again because it is just that. To emphasize this, well, I do have some save games from across the experience, but to begin with, I simply sat down and played the game for about 1 hour, 45 minutes, capturing and analyzing the input. And well, that 60 frames per second line does not falter. It is always 60 frames per second. It's that rare thing, a properly locked 60 FPS with no dips. Except, well, maybe you just caught there a flash at the 28-minute mark. A small drop to performance in this cutscene as Kratos first meets the stranger. I actually missed it until I took a look at the time-lapse, but it is there, and what you're seeing here is actually a retest. First rule of thumb when doing frame rate analysis is that if something looks wrong, it usually is wrong and needs a retest, but here it checks out, and this is literally the only drop to performance that I saw throughout my entire time with the game. It's a non-playable moment. I missed it the first time round, but yup, it is there. Now, looking back at some of the other back compat plus titles I've looked at, there were some rare one-off drops in Ghost of Tsushima via its own PS5 patch. More statistical anomalies more than anything else, but they were there. I could set up enormous hordes in Days Gone and push PS5 backwards compatibility to its limits there within that specific scenario, and there were some drops. But here in God of War, whether it's in this 95-minute blast of gaming that you're looking at here via time-lapse, or in the captures I took via saves from later on in the game, it's just 60 frames per second, always. With just that single drop in a single cutscene, seeing any deviation in the frame rate graph there. Put simply, it's, well, awesome. Just is super smooth from start to finish. So that's really where I should probably leave this video, because in Mortal Kombat parlance, I'd say that this is a flawless victory for PlayStation 5. Well, I say flawless, but the one criticism you can level at this patch, and indeed the other Back Compat Plus titles, is that this is simply an unlocked framerate modification. It has not been enhanced in the way that, say, Spider-Man Remastered has, for example. It's still checkerboard 4K too, of course, and while native resolution rendering would have been nicer or cleaner, CBR artifacts tend to blend into post-processing. I don't think it's a big deal. This is still very much a 4K experience when played on a 4K screen. One thing Alex mentioned to me was that subsequent God of War patches may have reduced volumetric quality slightly compared to Goldmaster and early patch code. This tree is the classic example where we can get a really good look at the volumetrics, and I've taken this footage from John's original analysis. Here's how it looks in the new version 1.35. It may look a little different perhaps, but getting a lined up like-for-like shot wasn't easy. If there is a reduction in quality, well, I don't think it will affect your enjoyment of the game, to be honest. Quality of life improvements, well, that's another thing. You see, I've already mentioned the complete lack of noise generated by the PlayStation 5, certainly in relation to legacy PS4 consoles, but there are loading time improvements too. Only really applies to death and accessing saved games, as during the experience there is no noticeable loading. But 21 seconds to load in this save versus 41 on the PlayStation 4 Professional. Well, not game-changing perhaps, you're not seeing a cartridge-like improvement as we saw with the recent Neo collection, but obviously it's a nice bonus nonetheless. So that's where we are. Now you don't need the disc version of God of War to run the game at checkerboard 4K 60 FPS on PlayStation 5. You can do it from any version now, and that's a big deal. Specifically because God of War is available as part of the PlayStation collection you automatically own as a PlayStation 5 owner that's subscribed to PlayStation Plus. So that's God of War joining Days Gone with a 60 frames per second update in the PlayStation collection, and outside of the collection, well, Ghost of Tsushima, I'd still highly recommend getting that. The upgrade for PlayStation 5 at 60 is just excellent. But that does leave The Last Guardian. For now, that one, it can be run at 60 frames per second on PlayStation 5, but only with the disc. There's still no update there for download versions, which is a touch unfortunate. It's the sort of game that early adopters who've embraced PlayStation 5 would really appreciate, I think. But it is an old game. Updating it to the latest cross-generation SDK may not be as simple as it sounds. But there is still the elephant in the room, right? What's going on with The Last of Us Part 2? What we can say with some degree of certainty is that the other titles are reasonably easy to unlock to give you that extra frame rate. But different engines are architected in different ways, and if you look at the effort that went into getting Death Stranding running at high frame rates on PC, and the difficulties encountered with Horizon Zero Dawn doing likewise, it's clear that delivering that upgrade isn't always so easy. But The Last of Us Part 2 on PlayStation 5 will be a big deal, and surely it will be with us at some point, right? Anyway, that's the end of the video, so please like, subscribe, share, ring the notification bell to be alerted via the device of your choice when new DF content lands, and remember that supporting the DF Patreon allows you to download a pristine version of this video, and well, basically any other we've released since November 2016. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching. Finally, a headset that can be as expressive as you. G733 is wireless and designed for comfort, and it's outfitted with all the surround sound, voice filters and advanced lighting you need to look, sound and play with more style than ever. Lightspeed Wireless technology lets you game wirelessly without compromises in latency, connectivity or battery. Play in complete freedom with over 20 hours of battery life and a range of up to 15 meters.